Chapter 1. The stage is set. The room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists whispered. Leaders exchanged nervous glances. The Paris Defense and Strategy Forum had seen many speeches, but this one felt different. The air was thick with tension. Reporters gripped their pens, ready to write history. Some leaders leaned forward, eyes locked on the stage. Others sat still, arms crossed. No one knew exactly what Emmanuel Macron would say. But everyone understood the stakes. The doors at the back of the hall opened. A hush spread through the room. Macron entered, walking slowly, deliberately. Cameras flashed. Aides followed behind him, their expressions serious. He climbed the steps to the podium, adjusted his suit, and looked out at the world. For a moment, he said nothing. He scanned the crowd, meeting the eyes of diplomats, generals, and journalists. Then, he took a deep breath. The microphones were live. The world was listening. Would he challenge the global order? Would he shake Europe's alliances? His fingers tapped lightly on the podium. A small movement, but the only sound in the room. Then, he spoke. My fellow Europeans and friends across the world, we stand at a crossroads. Some leaders nodded. Others shifted in their seats. For too long, Europe has relied on others to guarantee its security. For too long, we have waited for decisions made in Washington, in Brussels, in foreign capitals. Today, that must change. A murmur rippled through the room. Journalists scribbled notes. Macron's gaze remained steady. He wasn't asking for permission. He was delivering a message. He continued. The war in Ukraine has shown us one thing. Europe must take responsibility for its own future, our security, our defense, our peace. We cannot wait for others to act. We must be ready. We must be strong. We must lead. A pause. A heavy silence. The words hung in the air. Was this a challenge to NATO? A break from the past? A woman in the front row, Germany's defense minister, narrowed her eyes. A French general, sitting beside her, nodded slightly. The president of the European Council rested his chin on his hands, listening carefully. Macron raised his chin. His voice grew stronger. We must ask ourselves, if war comes to our borders, are we prepared? If an ally is attacked, do we have the power to defend them? If Ukraine falls, what happens next? He let the questions settle. Let the weight of them sink in. A man in the back of the room, an American diplomat, shifted uncomfortably. His arms tightened across his chest. Was France turning away from the U.S.? Was this the start of something new or something dangerous? Macron's hands gripped the edges of the podium. His voice dropped, just slightly. This is not a speech about fear. It is a speech about strength, about courage, about Europe, standing together. A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Was it frustration? Determination? Perhaps both. He glanced at the Ukrainian ambassador, sitting near the front. Their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. We cannot wait for peace to be given to us. We must secure it ourselves with unity, with action, with resolve. A few leaders exchanged glances. Some seemed inspired, others concerned. And yet, the room was captivated. Outside the Grand Hall, in capitals across the world, televisions and radios broadcasted his words. In Kyiv, Ukrainian soldiers listened from a base. In Washington, officials watched closely. In Moscow, the Kremlin was silent. Macron took another breath. He was not finished. Some will say this vision is impossible, that Europe cannot lead its own defense, that we must always depend on others. But I ask you, when has Europe ever been stronger than when it stood together? A slow murmur of approval spread through the hall. He was building momentum. Today, I call upon our allies, our friends, our neighbors. It is time for a new chapter, a chapter where Europe does not wait, a chapter where Europe acts. His voice rang out, steady and unwavering. We have the technology. We have the economy. We have the power. What we need now is the will. A moment of silence. Then, applause. It started slowly, cautiously. A few hands clapping. Then more. Then a wave of sound. Macron stood tall. His message had landed. The world had heard. But the real question remained. Would they act? Would this speech change history or be forgotten in the noise of politics? Macron looked out at the faces before him. The answer, he knew, was yet to come. The cameras zoomed in. The moment had arrived, and the world was watching. Chapter 2. A Call to Action. Europe must take charge of its future. Macron's voice rang through the hall. No hesitation, no doubt. His words echoed, bouncing off the grand walls, reaching every ear, filling the air with urgency. The audience held their breath. Some leaned forward, others frowned. No one could ignore the weight of his words. The cameras captured everything. The flicker of tension in the room, the shifting of seats, the careful, cautious expressions of world leaders who knew this was not just another speech. Macron's eyes swept across the hall. His gaze was steady, filled with conviction. We can no longer wait. We can no longer rely on others. The time has come for Europe to stand on its own. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered to their aides. Notes were passed. Messages were sent. This was bold. This was unexpected. Macron took a step forward. His voice dropped, but it carried even more power. For too long, we have depended on alliances that were not always built for us. For too long, we have waited for decisions made across the Atlantic. Today, I say, no more. a pause, a breath, a heartbeat. Then, reaction. Some clapped, softly, hesitantly. Others remained silent. The American delegation sat still, their faces unreadable. The German Chancellor tilted his head slightly, listening. The British Prime Minister tapped a finger on the table, considering. Macron continued, his voice stronger now. Look at Ukraine. Look at what we face. War on our borders. Instability, uncertainty. And yet, we wait. We wait for orders. We wait for promises. We wait for someone else to act. A man in the front row, a European defense official, shifted uncomfortably. He knew what Macron was saying. He had seen it, the hesitation, the endless discussions, the fear of stepping forward without permission. Macron took a breath. His next words came slowly, deliberately. But waiting does not bring peace. Waiting does not protect our people. Waiting is a choice, and it is a choice we must no longer make. The tension was growing. The room felt warmer now. Or was it the pressure? The weight of history being written in real time? Macron's hand rested on the podium. His fingers pressed against the wood. He knew the risks of what he was saying, but he also knew the stakes. I say this not as the President of France, but as a European, as a leader who believes in the strength of this continent. We have the resources, we have the technology, we have the will. What we need is the courage to act. Somebody coughed. A chair creaked. A journalist scribbled furiously in a notebook. The speech was reaching its peak. Everyone could feel it. Macron's voice dropped again, almost a whisper now. If we do not take charge of our security, who will? If we do not defend our values, who will? If we do not shape our own future, someone else will do it for us. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. It was not just a speech anymore. It was a challenge, a call, a warning. Macron let the silence settle. Let the words sink in. Then he straightened his posture. Some will say this is too ambitious. Some will say this is impossible. To them I ask, was the European Union impossible? Was peace in Europe impossible? Was rebuilding after war impossible? No, nothing is impossible when Europe stands together. The first real applause began, scattered but growing. Some leaders hesitated, then, slowly, more hands joined in. The room filled with the sound of clapping. Macron gave a small nod. He had made his point, but the real challenge was still ahead. Would they act, or would these words be forgotten? And the decision was theirs to make. In Chapter 3, the Ukraine crisis and NATO's role. Ukraine was still at war. Cities lay in ruins. Families were torn apart. Soldiers stood on the front lines, waiting, watching, hoping. The world had promised to help. But was it enough? In the grand hall of the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum, Macron's voice cut through the silence. Europe must do more. A ripple ran through the room. Some leaders nodded, others frowned. The words were simple, but the meaning was not. More? What did that mean? More weapons? More troops? More direct involvement? The tension grew. Everyone in the room knew that one sentence, just 5 words, could change everything. Macron took a breath. He knew the weight of what he was about to say. Ukraine fights not just for itself, but for all of us, for freedom, for security, for the right to live without fear. If Ukraine falls, what message does that send? If we turn away, what does that say about us? A deep silence followed. The Ukrainian ambassador sat near the front. His face was unreadable, but his hands were clasped tightly together. His country had fought for years. His people had suffered. He knew what more meant. It meant survival. Macron continued. NATO has done much. The alliance has been strong. But let us ask ourselves, who carries the weight? Who takes the risks? Who pays the highest price? Eyes turned toward the American delegation. The United States had led NATO for decades. It had sent billions in aid. It had provided weapons, intelligence, support. But Europe? Had Europe done enough? Macron's gaze swept across the room. He let the question linger. No one answered. He pressed on. We cannot wait for Washington. We cannot assume the United States will always lead. This is our continent. This is our responsibility. And if we fail Ukraine, we fail ourselves. A murmur spread. Some ministers leaned toward their aides, whispering. The German chancellor looked deep in thought. The British Prime Minister adjusted his tie, glancing at his advisers. Was Macron suggesting a shift? A change in NATO's role? A European-led force? The American ambassador sat motionless, listening. Macron's voice dropped, softer now. I know the fears. I know the risks. But I also know this. Peace does not come from hesitation. Security does not come from waiting. Ukraine fights today, so we do not have to fight tomorrow. A few hands clenched into fists, not in anger, but in agreement. For 2 years, Ukraine had stood strong. But at what cost? Cities destroyed, lives lost, and still the war dragged on. Macron continued, his words measured, careful. Some say diplomacy is the answer, that we must talk, that we must negotiate. And yes, diplomacy is important. But tell me, what peace can be made with a gun to your head? The Ukrainian ambassador blinked hard. Others shifted in their seats. The Russian delegation was not in the room, but their presence was felt. Macron's tone sharpened. We must give Ukraine what it needs, not just to survive, but to win. The weight of that statement was heavy. Win? Did he mean complete victory? Did he mean pushing Russia back out of every inch of Ukraine? Some leaders nodded. Others looked down. And we must ask, what comes next? If Ukraine wins, do we abandon them? If Ukraine falls, do we look away? No, we must be clear. We must be committed. This is not about months, but years. This is not about promises, but action. A woman in the back of the hall, a European defense minister, took a deep breath. This speech, it was not just words, it was pressure. It was a call. Macron stepped back from the podium for a moment. He let the silence do its work. Then he delivered his final message. The world is watching. Our allies are watching. But most of all, Ukraine is watching. And they are asking, will Europe stand with them, or will we let history repeat itself? The room held its breath. No one spoke. Because this was not just a question, it was a test. And soon, the world would see who was ready to answer it. Chapter 4. The Battle for European Autonomy. The air in the hall grew heavier. The words had been spoken. Strong words. Words that could change alliances or break them. Our security cannot depend on decisions made in Washington. The audience tensed. Some looked at each other. Some looked down. Others simply stared at Macron, their expressions unreadable. Was this a challenge to NATO? A warning to the United States? Or the first step towards something new? Macron stood firm. His hands gripped the edges of the podium. His voice steady but urgent. For decades, Europe has relied on others for protection. We have trusted in the strength of our allies. We have believed that when danger comes, someone will stand for us. But today, I ask, can we afford that belief? No one moved. The silence was sharp, uncomfortable. The words echoed. Some leaders frowned. Others shifted in their seats. The American delegation remained still, their faces calm. But inside, were they angry? Concerned? Macron's voice softened, but the weight of his message remained. This is not about breaking alliances. This is not about turning our backs on our friends. But we must be honest. Our interests are not always the same. Our priorities are not always aligned. And when the moment of crisis comes, who will make the final decision? Washington or Europe? A murmur ran through the room. Some nodded. Some whispered to their aides. A few took notes, their pens moving quickly across paper. Macron took a step forward. His next words were slow, deliberate. Europe is strong. We have the economy, we have the technology, we have the resources, and yet, when it comes to defense, we wait, we depend, we hesitate. A brief pause. Then his voice rose. That must end. A ripple of energy spread through the hall. Some hands tightened into fists. Some lips pressed together. This was bold. This was dangerous. But was it also necessary? Macron continued. I ask you, why is it that when Europe faces a crisis, we look to Washington? Why do we turn to another continent for decisions about our own security? Are we not capable? Are we not prepared? Or Are we simply afraid? The last word cut through the room like a knife. Afraid. The idea hung in the air. No one wanted to be seen as weak. No leader wanted to admit it. Macron's eyes moved across the audience. He had their attention. He had their emotions. Now, he had to push forward. We cannot afford fear. We cannot afford delay. We must build our own security. We must take control of our own defense, not tomorrow, not next year, but now. The French defense minister nodded slightly. The German chancellor pursed his lips. The Polish president sat back, arms crossed, listening carefully. Macron exhaled, then continued. Some will say this is a risk. Some will say we are stronger under the shield of others. But I ask, what is the greater risk? Depending on someone else or standing on our own? The American ambassador remained still. No reaction, no expression, but the room knew. This message was not just for Europe, it was for the world. A true partnership is built on equality. A strong Europe makes NATO stronger. A strong Europe makes the West stronger. But a Europe that waits, a Europe that depends, makes us all weaker. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then, the final blow. We have trusted in Washington for generations, but trust must be mutual. Europe must not only be protected, Europe must be a protector. The words landed. The room felt different now. The shift had happened. Some saw this as the future. Others saw it as a threat. But no one could ignore it. Macron had drawn the line. And now, the world would have to respond. Chapter 5. Security Guarantees for Ukraine. If we want peace, we must act. The words were clear, sharp. They cut through the silence of the hall like a blade. Macron stood tall at the podium. His voice was calm, but behind it was something stronger. Determination. The leaders of Europe, of NATO, of the world listened. Some nodded. Some frowned. Some whispered to their aides, their faces unreadable. At the front of the hall, the Ukrainian president sat still, his hands clasped together, his expression serious. He had heard many promises, many speeches, but today, would he hear something different? Macron took a deep breath. He knew the risks of his next words. For 2 years, Ukraine has fought. It has defended its cities, its people, its independence. And for 2 years, we have helped. But today, we must ask, is it enough? A murmur spread through the room. Was it enough? The French president continued. We have sent weapons, we have sent aid, we have trained soldiers, and yet the war continues, the destruction continues, and still Ukraine stands alone on the battlefield. His voice grew heavier. That must change. A hush fell over the hall. Some glanced toward the American delegation. Others glanced toward the Ukrainian president, waiting for his reaction. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply listened. Macron's hands rested on the podium, his fingers pressed against the wood. We cannot wait for the war to end before we act. We cannot hope for peace while preparing for retreat. We must guarantee Ukraine's security, not for months, not for a year, but for generations. A journalist in the back quickly jotted down notes. A European general narrowed his eyes, considering the meaning of these words. A security guarantee? What did that mean? More weapons? More troops? A new alliance? Macron continued. Some say Ukraine cannot join NATO until the war is over. Some say security must come later. But I ask you, can Ukraine afford to wait? Can we? Tension filled the room. A shift in posture, a nervous glance, a held breath. The Ukrainian president's fingers tightened slightly. It was barely visible, but it was there. Macron's voice dropped, lower now. If we abandon Ukraine today, what happens tomorrow? If we leave it unprotected, how long before history repeats itself? The words hung in the air, heavy, unspoken fears settling into the minds of those in the room. Macron did not wait for an answer. He already knew it. A free Ukraine is a strong Ukraine. A strong Ukraine is a strong Europe, and a strong Europe is a safer world. Slowly, he straightened his back. France is ready. Ready to give Ukraine what it needs. Ready to stand beside our allies. Ready to build a European defense force that protects not just borders, but the values we hold dear. Some leaders nodded. Others remained frozen. The American ambassador listened, his face expressionless. The German chancellor looked down at the table, deep in thought. The Polish president sat forward, interested. Macron met their eyes, one by one. We must give Ukraine real security, not just words, not just hope, a guarantee, a promise, a shield. A European shield, a defense force, something separate from NATO? The room felt warmer now. Or was it the pressure? Macron let the silence settle before delivering his final words. Today, we decide. Will we make history, or will we repeat it? The hall remained still. The decision was no longer his. The world was watching. Chapter 6. The Global Reaction. The world responded, fast. News anchors repeated Macron's words. Headlines flashed across screens. Analysts debated. Some called it bold. Some called it dangerous. But no one ignored it. In Paris, the streets buzzed with discussion. Some people cheered. Others shook their heads. Was this the future of Europe? Or a risk too great to take? In Washington, concern grew. Advisors whispered behind closed doors. Phone calls were made. Was Macron challenging the U.S.? Was he pulling Europe away from NATO? The White House remained silent, but inside they were watching closely. In Moscow, anger boiled. The Kremlin released a statement, strong words, cold warnings, but beneath them, a question. Was France leading Europe toward confrontation? And in Brussels? Confusion. The European Union had always been careful with words, careful with promises. Now they had to choose. Would they stand behind Macron or step away from his vision? Inside NATO headquarters, the mood was tense. A meeting was called. Defense ministers, generals, ambassadors, they all came. A man from the U.S. spoke first. His voice was calm, but firm. France wants more military independence. That is clear. But is Europe ready for this? A German official leaned forward. Macron is right. We cannot rely on the U.S. forever. Europe must be able to defend itself. A British representative shook his head. Yes, but at what cost? NATO is our shield. If we weaken it, we all suffer. The discussion continued. Voices rose. The debate was fierce. Some saw opportunity. Some saw danger. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the Ukrainian president listened to Macron's speech again. His advisors stood around him, waiting for his reaction. He did not speak at first. Then, finally, "This is what we have been waiting for." A murmur of approval passed through the room. Ukraine had fought for so long. It had asked for help. It had begged for stronger support. Now, it seemed, someone was listening. But promises were easy. Action was not. In Berlin, the German chancellor held a press conference. Cameras flashed. The world waited. He cleared his throat. His words were careful, measured. We welcome discussions on European defense, but this must be done together. Together. A word that meant many things, a word that left room for doubt. That evening, Macron sat in his office. His team stood nearby. Reports arrived every minute. Some leaders supported him. Others were afraid. Some were unsure. One of his advisors exhaled. "You've started something big." Macron didn't look up. His eyes remained on the reports, scanning every detail. Then, finally, he spoke. "Yes, but will they follow?" No one answered, because no one knew, and the world was waiting. Chapter 7. Tensions with the U.S. The air was heavy with uncertainty. The world had heard Macron's speech. The message was clear. But one question remained. How would the United States respond? For decades, the U.S. had led NATO. It had provided security. It had set the rules. Now, Macron was pushing for change. A stronger Europe. A Europe that did not wait for Washington's approval. Inside the White House, the mood was tense. Advisors sat around a long table. Some leaned forward, listening carefully. Others sat back, arms crossed. A large screen displayed Macron's speech, paused on a single sentence. Our security cannot depend on decisions made in Washington. A man from the State Department spoke first. This is dangerous. If Europe moves away from us, NATO will weaken. Another official shook his head. Or, it could make NATO stronger. If Europe takes more responsibility, maybe we can share the burden. Silence. A moment of thought. Then, the Secretary of Defense leaned forward. His voice was calm but firm. It's not just about sharing responsibility. It's about control. If Europe builds its own defense force, will they still follow NATO, or will they go their own way? No one had an answer. Across the Atlantic, in Brussels, NATO leaders gathered. The tension in the room was clear. Some were worried, some were excited, but everyone knew something was changing. The British ambassador spoke first. France wants more independence. Fine, but let's be honest. Can Europe defend itself without the US? The German defense minister adjusted his glasses. Maybe not today, but in 10 years, 20. If we never start, we will never be ready. The American general sitting at the end of the table sighed. We don't want division. We don't want a weak NATO. But if European leaders think they can do this alone, they are making a mistake. Another silence. Another moment of thought. Macron's words had created a ripple. Now, it was turning into a wave. In Paris, Macron met with his advisors. Reports had arrived from Washington. They were watching. They were thinking. But they had not decided how to respond. One of his top aides spoke. The U.S. will not like this. They see it as a challenge. Macron nodded slowly. It is a challenge, but not to them, to us, to Europe, to be stronger, to be ready. His voice was steady, determined. His advisor hesitated. And if they push back? Macron exhaled. Then we explain, we reassure, we show them this is not about breaking NATO. It is about preparing for the future. His advisor nodded, but his expression remained unsure. In Washington, the president listened to his advisors. Some wanted a strong response, a warning. Others said to wait, to watch, to see what happened next. The president finally spoke. We built NATO together. We kept Europe safe together. If Macron wants Europe to do more, fine. But we cannot let this weaken our alliance. His words were careful, measured. This was not the time for anger. This was the time for strategy. But behind closed doors, some officials were frustrated. Macron is trying to take control. France always wants to lead. If Europe builds its own army, what happens to NATO? The questions continued. The uncertainty grew. At a press conference the next day, a reporter asked the White House press secretary, "Does the United States support President Macron's vision for European defense?" A pause, a flicker of hesitation, then the answer. The United States supports a strong Europe. We believe in NATO. We believe in partnership. And we will continue to work closely with our European allies. The words were diplomatic, safe. But the real discussions were happening behind the scenes. Would this moment bring NATO closer, or would it push Europe and the US apart? No one knew yet. But one thing was clear. The transatlantic bond had never been more uncertain. Chapter 8. A Vision for the Future. The hall was silent. The speech was over. But the words still echoed in the minds of those who had heard them. Macron's dream was clear. A Europe that could defend itself. A Europe that no longer depended on others. A Europe that led the world, not followed it. But was it possible? Could a European army replace NATO? Could France lead a military revolution? Could Europe truly stand alone? The questions swirled. The words were powerful. The vision was bold. But the road ahead was full of obstacles. Macron stepped away from the podium. He could feel the weight of the moment. He had spoken his truth. He had challenged the old ways. Now he had to wait. The reaction had been mixed. Some leaders had applauded. Others had remained quiet. A few had already left the room. In Berlin, the German chancellor sat in his office, deep in thought. Macron's speech played on a small screen. He listened again, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. A united European defense. A force separate from NATO. It was an idea that had been discussed before, but never like this. Never with such urgency. He turned to his advisors. Is this realistic? A general shifted in his chair. It would take years, decades even. Military coordination, funding, political agreements. The challenges are enormous. The chancellor nodded. And yet, he is right about one thing. We cannot depend on the US forever. The words hung in the air. No one disagreed, but no one had an answer either. Across the Channel in London, the British Prime Minister frowned. Macron's speech was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. The UK had left the European Union, but it was still a part of NATO. Would Europe really break away? An aide spoke. Macron is pushing hard. He wants Europe to lead. The Prime Minister sighed. Yes, but where is he leading us? In Brussels, the European Council debated. Some countries supported Macron's vision, others feared it. Would this idea bring Europe together, or pull it apart? A diplomat from Poland leaned forward. We cannot risk division. If Europe wants to defend itself, fine, but NATO must remain strong. A French minister responded quickly. NATO will remain, but it must evolve. It must become a partnership, not a dependency. A long discussion followed. Voices rose. Opinions clashed. Some believed Europe had no choice but to change. Others worried Macron was moving too fast. Meanwhile, in Paris, Macron sat with his closest advisors. The speech had been given. The world was reacting. Now the hard work began. One of his aides placed a report on the table. Mixed reactions, some support, some hesitation. Washington is watching closely. Macron rubbed his chin. Good. They should watch. Another advisor shifted in his seat. And if they push back? If NATO sees this as a threat? Macron leaned forward. Then we explain. This is not about breaking alliances. This is about building something stronger. His voice was calm, but there was fire in his eyes. Outside, the city lights of Paris glowed. The Seine moved slowly through the heart of France, as it always had. But something felt different. The air was charged. The moment was real. Macron had set something in motion. A conversation. A challenge. A vision. The next steps were unclear. The future was uncertain. But one thing was undeniable. Europe would never be the same again. Chapter 9. What happens next? The speech was over. The cameras had stopped recording. The crowd had dispersed. But the words still echoed. Leaders returned to their offices. Phones rang. Messages were sent. Some felt inspired. Some felt nervous. Everyone knew something had changed. Macron had made his vision clear. A Europe that defended itself. A Europe that did not wait. But was the world ready? In Berlin, the German Chancellor sat at his desk. His advisors surrounded him. Macron is pushing hard, one of them said. The Chancellor nodded slowly. Yes, but is Europe ready to follow? No one answered. In London, the British Prime Minister leaned back in his chair. He had listened to the speech twice. It was powerful. It was ambitious. But was it practical? An aide hesitated before speaking. If Europe builds its own defense, where does that leave NATO? The Prime Minister exhaled. That is the question, isn't it? Across the ocean in Washington, the response was different. Inside the White House, officials gathered. The mood was tense. Some saw Macron's speech as an opportunity. Others saw it as a warning. A senior advisor crossed his arms. He wants Europe to lead. Fine. But does he expect us to step back? No one spoke. The president finally sighed. We need to talk to him. Soon. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the reaction was quieter, but more dangerous. The Kremlin's main hall was dimly lit. Russian officials sat around a long table. The president of Russia stared at the screen. Macron's words played again. Europe must be ready. Europe must be strong. Europe must act. The Russian leader's face did not change, but his advisors knew what he was thinking. Macron's speech was not just words. It was a signal, a message, a threat. One of the Russian generals spoke. If Europe arms itself, if they build their own army, what does that mean for us? No one had the answer. Back in Paris, Macron sat with his team. Reports were coming in from every corner of the world. Some leaders had expressed support. Others were hesitant. One advisor cleared his throat. The Americans will want a conversation. The Germans are thinking. The British are cautious. And Moscow, well, we know how they feel. Macron tapped his fingers on the table. He had expected this. Change was never easy. His chief of staff leaned forward. The question is, what happens next? A heavy silence followed. Macron looked around the room. His team was waiting. France was waiting. Europe was waiting. Then, finally, he spoke. We move forward. The path was uncertain. The risks were real. But the moment had arrived. Macron had changed the conversation. Now, it was time to see if the world was ready to listen.